우세, 와나에.
안녕하세요.
你好.
Welcome to University of the West, a private, non-profit Buddhist-affiliated university located on 11 beautiful acres of hillside outside of Los Angeles, California. University of the West was founded upon the values of character, compassion, and community.
Good evening, everybody. Let's welcome Lou for his lecture on challenges of contemporary followers, growth of urban society. And you are very familiar with Lou. And tonight, entrusted by Dr. Iwamura, I just express our welcome to Lou on behalf of the department. So let's welcome Lou for this lecture.
Thank you very much, Darui, and hello everyone. Thank you again for showing up once again with all this. Wait till the camera warms up a bit.
Yeah, just text something on the song.
Well, sometimes the lectures go into one discipline or another. Tomorrow morning, my lecture will be psychology, I suppose. Tonight, it's sociology. Sometimes it's philosophy. So you never know what you're going to get. Tonight, though, is a little more sociological than usual, but it's some issues which I think are really demanding attention from Buddhist communities, and particularly those of you who are here in Los Angeles area. These are all, I think, very cogent to the kinds of challenges that are before you. We live in a world in which the urban is becoming larger, greater, and more dominant all the time. For a long time, the world's largest cities, as you can see from this chart, the world's largest cities never exceeded 5 million people. And it was only when we come to the 20th century that the great cities, the mega cities that we know of today, finally came into existence. And now, instead of just New York as the one city in the world that had 10 million people at one time, there are now 25 cities that have 10 million or more people. And New York is not the most populous city anymore. I don't think we know what the populations of lots of our largest cities are. I once talked to someone in Shanghai, and I said, "How many people do you have?" And since he is a geographer, I thought he probably might actually know the answer to that. And he made this wry face and said, "Well, we counted up to 28 million and stopped counting." So, who knows is what we have. But the world is becoming urban. And not only is it becoming urban, but it's becoming urban with huge cities. And those cities are becoming more dominant all the time in our society. Should I stop there? When we go around the world to the cities, they have many shapes. The density varies. We can see that what's happening in many places is that people from the rural areas are flooding into cities. And it's hard for cities to handle it. So in many cases, the people that flood into the cities have developed shanty towns, sort of newly sprung up, we might call them slums. The infrastructure to handle it is very difficult for many of these people. But the question about cities is not just their density, and it is really dense, you see Seoul, Korea. Seoul, Korea has no slums. Absolutely none. It's one of the few large cities in the world that I've ever seen that just does not have a slum. People are put in high-rise towers, structures, 100,000 to a park, with almost no green space around many of them. There are problems with that, but there's no slums. They've really done a good job. They have shared their wealth with all their people in many ways. Mexico City that you see with the density down below. When you're faced with that kind of density in that size city, you can understand the problems that are presented to people who are trying to deal with this. So the interesting thing is that as new cities develop, the poorer the city, the more dense. In other words, the cities that have more money spread out. Los Angeles is a very good example. Los Angeles, in many ways, is a rich city. And so people have large lots. Everything is spread out. There's no real extreme focus of density in this whole LA basin. But if you go to other places, then you can look to see what the economic status of a place is by its density almost. And that means that the people who flood in from the rural areas into cities that become very densely populated because that's the only thing they can afford. In other words, in order to live, you can only afford so much space. And so since you can only afford a little bit of space, you can have 15 people in a house that might have one person in a more developed country's city. So that's part of what we face, is this kind of density. The problem with density of this type is it brings with it a whole different kind of culture that we're having to learn how to live with. That is, how do you create community in a large, dense megacity? How do you determine who your neighbors are? Do you live your whole life in being anonymous? It's like I recently talked to a friend of mine in New York who lives in Manhattan. Says that he doesn't think that he's ever met anybody he knows on the street, and he's lived there for 15 years. In other words, he lives in a large city and he's always with strangers. And in large cities, that can happen to you. As you know, many of you are here in Los Angeles. You go to a shopping mall, if you happen to run into somebody that you know, it's rather rare. You're quite taken aback, my goodness, what are you doing? We see people being surprised to see somebody they actually know. So people are anonymous. Being anonymous can also mean that you feel alienated. You don't have roots. You don't have anybody who cares for you. You are totally self-sufficient. The only hope that you have is that there's some kind of structure like the police or the fire department or the ambulance to take care of you. Without these city services and infrastructure, who is there to take care of you in the large city? Who knows you? Who's going to come forward when you're in a totally strange environment? And this is happening all over the world. We're having these large megacities are growing up all over the world, and particularly in Asia. So the homelands of Buddhism are all faced with this growth of the urban, and that urban growth is challenging places that never had that challenge before. So if you look at where the really big places are, it's parts of Africa, here in North America, but of course China and India, or the fantastically large places where these urban things are being developed. And we are all going to have to face what that urban environment is going to bring us. I did a little research. I went through and I thought of most of the places where we find Buddhism, and I checked with the demographics to say which Buddhist countries are still rural and which have become dominantly urban. And as you can see, that those that are dominantly rural are particularly the Southeast Asia and South Asia Buddhist groups. India, with its huge population, it's amazing that it still has not crossed the point where they're more urban than rural. India, with its huge population, is still dominant rural. Sri Lanka is 80% rural. So when I talk about the cities and Buddhism, you have to realize that it's not equal everywhere in the world. In other words, for many of you who come from places, here's Bhante here, who from Sri Lanka, well, his country is still rural. So therefore, the form of Buddhism which develops in that place is going to be far different than if we move over to a place like Hong Kong or Singapore, which are both 100% urban. Neither one of them counts any farmers anymore. They've just done away with farmers. It's totally urban. China has just passed the point. China has just come to the place where there are more people that are urban than rural. It went across the line. But Malaysia, the USA, Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, these are places that are surprisingly urbanized. We don't think of the US as being so urbanized because we have a lot of empty space. Or you don't think of Australia as being an urban country because you've got all that space in Australia in the outback. But Australia is over 90% urban. Almost nobody lives in a rural environment. So in Australia, the way in which Buddhism has to operate in Australia is within an urban environment. The same for the US. The same for all of Malaysia even. These nations have really become urban. So the questions that we're raising are divided. I can understand that the Theravada tradition, and even Vietnam, so Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, for them, they still have a period of time to go when they can operate with Buddhism as it serves a rural community. And so some of the changes which we see so dramatic in other places have not yet hit them. It's coming. They can feel it coming. They can see the flow of people. So when we look at the population, the which are primarily urban, you can see North and South America are almost totally urban dominant. Europe, even Russia, is a dominantly urban environment, even with Siberia. I mean, sometimes the planes that we fly on from Los Angeles to go to Asia fly over Siberia. You look down and you just see mile after mile of mountains, and you don't see the sign of a single human habitation. There are none. Once in a while you may see a road that you think leads maybe somewhere, and yet it's urban. That's because the people actually live in cities. They don't live out there in Siberia. You have land but no people in it. So the places that are still, as I've said, we can see India, Southeast Asia, and Africa. Those are the places where rural issues are still present, and where we see them moving toward what's going to happen with later urbanization. Sometime around 2012, the whole world shifted from rural to urban. There are now more urban people in the world than there are rural people. That's a really enormous shift in the way in which we live in this world. We have never had a world in which a dominant force in the whole of the earth was urban rather than rural. We've been farmers. We've all lived in little villages where everybody went out during the day and farmed their fields and came back at night. And the life of that is depicted and told in stories and songs and operas and the whole bit. But it's changing, and it's changing rather rapidly. If you look at the United States, that those places, for example, that have less than 50% are urban, we just have about 5 states, and many of them are small. The United States, as you look at it, is not, it's not a, you can color it all one color, but in fact, it's very varied. The rural and the urban struggle with one another, but the United States is an urban place. So if Buddhism wants to come to the United States, it has to come primarily to an urban environment, and it has to deal with all the problems that exist for the urban environment. So as I said, the Chinese, there's a little statement, they're all going to town. All the young people are going to the cities. And the millennials, those born since 1980, those millennials are going to live in a China where more people have gone to town than have stayed home on the farm. And we have the old joke in the US, how are you going to keep them down on the farm once they've seen what the city life can be? It's very hard. However, I don't know if we can see this, we have an apocalyptic vision about future cities. Our poetry, our movies, our novels do not depict this glorious world with shining cities on a hill. They are very, very often what we call dystopia. They are apocalyptic visions of cities that have crumbled and crashed, and everything is gone, and everything that we used to live with is all wiped out. And we have movies that are about the last person on earth and the cities that have disappeared so that there are individuals left in this dystopia. So you can look at Tokyo as it is today, but when you look at somebody who paints a painting of Tokyo, they'll show you this destroyed, what it's going to look like in some future time when the city is totally destroyed. So what is it in us that is so taken with this dystopia about cities? We really have a powerful movement about this is what's going to happen to us. We're all going to face this time when the cities will crumble and be just ruins. So here, for example, very popular painting of New York as apocalyptic, where trees are growing in Times Square. It's over. All the places that are filled with cars and lights and people, the paintings show us a city that's quiet, that's empty, that the trees are taking over. Nature is reclaiming itself. So we worry about cities. We really do. We worry because we build this enormous structure of a mega city, and then the question is, can we keep it? Can we keep doing this? Can we make this thing work? Will it keep on being like it is now? Or if the world shifts and changes, are we going to face this kind of dystopia city? And we have only one that I can think of, Chernobyl in Russia. Chernobyl is the only city which has been totally evacuated. It has no people in it anymore because of the atomic issue that arose when the reactor exploded and simply made the whole place radioactive. So if you go to Chernobyl, and people are taking cameras in, and people are studying it because they say, well, this is what happens to a city if you stop living there. And what happens is that very quickly, nature comes back in with plants. Nature doesn't just let it stay the way. The streets are growing up with trees, and it's foresting. It's reforesting itself. And so even though you've got the old freeways are there, even the high-rise apartment buildings, they're all now empty because you can't live there with the radiation levels. So people look at Chernobyl and study it as a point of view of, is this the future of cities? Is this what it will look like if our cities? So we do have an example, and people look at it with interest. On the other hand, urban life is seen and has many good features. Urban life, you have good hospitals, you have good support systems for schools, education, entertainment. People get together informally in city parks and spaces in the city. They put on performances. You can keep up with what's going on in the world of arts. The city, when you really look at it, has a lot of appeal. And that's why people have moved to the cities in many instances. The city is more exciting. So while we paint this other picture of the city, from another point of view, right now, the city is a magnet for any young person in many countries. It's a place that they want to be and they want to go. It is not a dystopia. It is a kind of utopia, an urban utopia, and people are heading toward it for that reason. The other thing is that the income in cities is so much greater than the rural areas. City folks, by comparison with farmers, are rich and getting richer. Farmers get poorer all the time. That is simply fact, so that we're changing the economic structures under which we live. So if a young man or a young woman is out on a farm in one of the developing countries, if they want to have a certain kind of life, they have, from their point of view, only one alternative. You got to go to town. You got to leave the farm. You have to go and become part of that, because you'll make more money, you'll have better education, you'll have better health, because you're going to have longer longevity goes up for city folks. You would think, hey, it's much healthier to live on a farm, right? But statistics say our urban people are living longer than our rural people around the world. Another thing that is coming with, I think, urbanization is that the role of women is changing dramatically. And some of that dramatic shift is hard to see at first, and we see it in retrospect rather than seeing it when it's actually occurring in front of us. One of the major things that's happening in this country, but this is worldwide, is that the percentage of college degrees for women is far outstripping college degrees being acquired by men. Our educational system is changing so rapidly, and we don't know what that means. What is the difference when we have a urban society in which we have a lot of very highly educated and it's good, I like it, women. I'm not saying they shouldn't do it, believe me. I think it's wonderful. But I also ask the question that we all have to ask, and educators are beginning to ask it, and so are sociologists. What is going on that men are not following suit? That men who once dominated in the educational system, that was bad, they shouldn't have had that dominance. But should either gender have a dominance? Nature has tried to keep genders equal. It was very hard to be equal. And one seems to always be taking over from the other. So for Buddhism in the future, I think that the fact that women are becoming so much more educated is a great challenge to Buddhism, because it is women who have primarily been a basic support structure for Buddhism. It's not that there aren't men in Buddhism, but all of you know, you took all of the women out of the groups that come to temples in Los Angeles, you wouldn't have a lot of Buddhist audience. You would not. These women that are coming now, often many of them are, of course, women who have not perhaps participated in this higher education move on the part of women. It's their granddaughters who are going to UCLA and getting MAs. The grandmother didn't do that, but the granddaughter is doing it. And so how is Buddhism going to deal with that granddaughter who is now educated far beyond what her grandmother was? Buddhism will have to deal with that. So that the urban environment is leading to higher education for women, no question about it. Higher education for women also has another very interesting thing, and that is the birth rate goes way down. The more educated women are, the fewer babies. It's true worldwide. They choose not to have the early marriage. They want to wait and have their own career, which is good. We have a lot of babies, so we don't have to worry that there aren't any babies in the world. But nevertheless, there are enormous changes that happen when education comes in, for whichever gender. So we're seeing a real shift. You know, when they did a study of who does best in writing proficiency tests in colleges and schools, the Buddhist and the atheist come out on top. In other words, why is it that the Buddhist and the atheist do so well? Why do the Buddhists do so well in this? I think we all know. That's because so many of them are of Asian descent, and the Asian descent has prized education so greatly that their children do very well in school because they get enormous support from their homes to do well in school. So that the Buddhist proficiency is not so much perhaps a religious activity on the part of Buddhists that they are showing up at such a high level of proficiency, as it is a kind of cultural pattern that comes to us from the Asian environment. So one of the things that attracts people to the city is health. If you look across the US, rural areas, now there are fewer and fewer doctors. There are many rural areas in the United States where the medical care is third world. I have some friends who live in a little town north of California, Eureka. It's way up north. Nice little town next to a university, state university, Humboldt. They've lost almost all their doctors. It's a town with no doctors. They have to rely on doctors who come 2 days a week from another city and have a little clinic time in their town, their city. I mean, that is not what we're used to in cities. We expect that you have a hospital and you've got doctors' offices and you've got dentists and you've got all this medical care and you just walk down the street and you get it. But across the country, it's not the case. There are many people who really can't find a doctor when they need them. And even emergency doctors are difficult to find. So as this shift occurs, you're going to have wonderful health care. I feel I'm very lucky. My HMO is University of California, San Francisco Medical School. That's my HMO. Well, that's great. I go in and they have 50 million specialists. So if I say, hey, I've got this little thing here, I've got this thing here, we know just who they come in. Oh yes, I can tell you what it is. For example, I have a little bump in my hand, and I said to the doctor, what is this little bump in my hand? Specialist came in and said, oh yeah, a lot of people have that. That's the nerve that goes to this finger. And you use that finger so much in your life that it has a sheath that grows out over it. And eventually you may want to go in there and cut that out. But yeah, we know what that is. I mean, to me it was just a little bump. Who was I to know that it's a diagnosable thing? I'm surprised when I go to a place where you have so many specialists, because I complain to the doctor and I said, you know, something's wrong with my skin on my back, because there's this one place and I can hardly reach to scratch it. And I think that there are moles or something growing there. Something's going on, it's not right, it itches all the time. Oh yeah, men have that. That's a spot on men's backs where the nerves grow in a particular way, and yeah, there's nothing you can do about it. You might try a little topical cream to put on it and keep it moist or something, but we know that. That's a particular thing. I mean, who would know such specifics about health? But you see, for most people, they don't have this kind of city help for health issues. They don't, so consequently, it again is a magnet for people to say, gosh, I'm getting worried. I live in a place where there's no doctor. I better move, because I've got a health problem and I'm going to have to go see a doctor every day or every week. I can't live out here in the middle of nowhere where I have to drive 5 or 6 hours to get to a doctor. I'm going to go live closer to the doctors. Urbanization. The medical profession is creating part of this urbanization. So when you go to doctors and you say, well, why won't you go out there to the country? There are all these people out there. Actually, living in the rural area is pretty nice. It's beautiful, clean air, and why don't you do it? And they say, there's a lack of cultural, educational opportunities for the family, 60%, 68%. They're concerned about the fact that they are on call 24 hours a day. There's nobody else out there but them. They never get a good night's sleep. They're always being on call. They have a limited subspecialty. They're not allowed, they don't have time to specialize in anything. They're just out there taking care of constant room full of people coming at them, so they don't want to be there. They would rather be in the city. They can become a specialist. And a third of them say, hey, you make so much less money. Why go out there and work for so little when I can stay here in this hospital and become very prosperous? And technology, all of these are issues. So the doctors have their reasons for doing what they're doing. And part of what they say is why other people are also saying, just like the doctors, they're saying, oh, if I move to the city, I have more culture, I have more opportunities for my family, it's an easier life for me, I'm going to do that. The other thing that's happening is, if you were thinking about an occupation, is that where once doctors outnumbered nurses, a large percentage, it's changed. Nurses are now outnumber doctors. And in the US and Sweden, for example, these most developed countries with their medical care, it's being done by nurses that are both male and female. That's no longer a female gender specific thing. We're having to change our way of thinking. So the city, as I said, it has a lot of problems. So you move to the city for all these good reasons. You think, I want to go. It's great. I can go to the opera. I can go to see the football game, the baseball. I can have all of this right before me. Anytime I want to do something, there it is. But in these dense areas, then what we have is there are no communities. And it does seem that the problem of community is much greater for young boys than for young girls. It seems for some reason that women and girls are able to create contact with one another, which fills in part of their need to have a social group. That's much more difficult for men. We have to face it. I mean, it seems very gender, doesn't it? But men have more trouble forming some kind of social situation for themselves, unless they form a gang. It's the gang. We can get together as a gang. And I'm pointing the finger. I'm male, so I know. So a lot of people who move into these regions, for example, you see here a map of Los Angeles and the area where the gangs are. We know where they are. We know why they're there. We know that these are areas where there's very little in the way of social structure for young people. We know that they're feeling alienated, and they look to say, who can be my community? I have no community. Nobody cares about me. Nobody pays any attention. The school is a disaster. Nothing is happening that's any good in my life. And along comes a gang of your peers who say, why don't you join us? We have a good time. And so when you get this, it's a form of idealism. That's what's so hard to understand about gangs. It's idealistic. It really is. It's not evil. It's idealism. People are complaining about people running off to Syria and joining gangs, if you wish. Why are they doing it? Both girls and young men, by large numbers, particularly in Europe. I think every Muslim family in Europe must be panicked about their young people. They're doing it out of idealistic reasons, basically. They aren't doing it to be evil or to be murderers. They're doing it for idealism. So if we have some way to respond to the mentality and to the thing which attracts people in the cities to this kind of light, there has to be an alternative, which is idealistic. And we have some of that. Stop the Violence here in Los Angeles, formed in Los Angeles, is one such thing. Instead of joining gangs that cause the violence, these groups organize themselves as a gang, if you will. They have their colors, they wear their uniforms, and when there's shooting, they are brave enough to walk out into the streets, and they do it here in LA all the time. They walk out into the streets in their uniforms and shout, "Stop the violence," and walk right into gunfights sometimes. Very brave young people. So that Stop the Violence group provides them with an idealistic alternative to the idealistic alternative of let's all get together and be antisocial. So I think that the Buddhists who are in this Los Angeles region really have to think about what is it that can be done to create this idealistic alternative to the gangs. Now, Venerable Da and I visit in prisons. We know that we see many Asian young men in the prisons. Smart young men, just tears your heart out to see them. They were in gangs. They came over. Their families brought them in some cases. Many of them were not born here, some were, but they're out, and these gangs become the only alternative to alienation and loneliness and lack of interest from anybody. And then they do something terrible. And they do a destructive act. They may be 16. When they get to be 18, they move them to the state prison for men, and many of them stay in prison for decades. That's something which, when you see them, you realize, this young person that I'm talking to, if somebody had touched them at the right moment, they wouldn't be here. You just know they wouldn't be there. So it's really crucial in our urban environments to recognize that this kind of fear and destructiveness which causes these gangs has to be addressed. And I think that if the Buddhists have to address it, because we're seeing people from Buddhist national groups in prison in fairly large numbers. So, immigrants. We have, the United States is one of the major places where immigration takes place. We have one of the largest group of immigrant communities in the world, always have. It's been a part of our country from the very beginning. I'm an immigrant family. They may have come over in the 17th century, but we were still immigrating. We were coming from Europe into the New World, as it was then known. So immigrants come in, and the immigrants face a double whammy, because they have to not only go into these dense cities often, because that's where they can first get a place to stay, but they've got to face what everybody faces in those dense cities in terms of the young people and education and the facilities. But they're also facing the ethnic prejudices and other situations. So they have a double issue for them. China, you can see the red is the areas of China that are decreasing in population, whereas the green are the ones that are growing in population. And primarily people are moving from the heartland of China to the coastline. If you looked at the density along the coast is far greater than the inland green. How does China China going to handle this? And that means that as Buddhism becomes a real part of Chinese life, and it is, then it's going to face this issue in China as well as the United States. How is Chinese Buddhism going to handle this enormous migration? Enormous. There's never been anything like it in terms of numbers. India has not had this yet. It'll come. India's going to face this. I'm convinced they will face it too. China's facing it right now. This is going on for them right at this moment. So how are they going to handle it? So even Taiwan, for example, all these colored places are Taiwan, the small little place, has people from those countries living in Taiwan as permanent residents. In other words, we think of Taiwan as just for the Taiwanese. Think again. Multicultural place. It has all of this. We're all multicultural, more and more. You go to London, you go to Paris, you go to Brazil, you go anywhere in the world, you go to Australia, and you realize that the immigration issue is worldwide. And we are having multifaceted immigration issues everywhere in the world. So Buddhism has to, in the future, figure out how to be transnational. And I really admire the fact that I think Master Xing Yun came up with this conclusion a long time ago, more than almost any Buddhist leader. He came up with the recognition that Buddhism, in order to serve what was happening in the world, had to become transnational. And so you have buildings in Taiwan, in New Zealand, in Paris, in France, very interesting, when they wanted to build a temple in Paris, the Parisian authorities say you can build it, but it can't look like a Chinese building. They would not let them build traditional culture, nor would they let the Muslims build mosque. They have to build it like this one. You can see up here, looks like a modern office building. It's required to try to hold down the differences and the distinctions that are being created by all of the new religions and all of the spread throughout. So immigration has with it religious overtones. The migration into Europe and to the US are both Buddhist, Muslim, Hindu. All of these immigration issues carry with them religion. They don't just go empty of any cultural baggage. They carry their own baggage with them as they go into it. And as this goes along, then you can understand that if you don't provide or create some kind of solution, particularly for the young people, then their religious tradition may be their solution. But if their solution turns out to be negative, then even that can have far-reaching effects, as we see with Islam in today's world. I think everybody who lives in Los Angeles should read the graphic novel, American Born Chinese. He's a young Los Angeles artist. It's a very disturbing book. You're not going to find it charming necessarily. Some of it is very humorous. But as an American-born Chinese, he expresses some of the problems which he faces. And some of this, you feel almost hatred for the first generation. They don't act right, they don't look right, they don't eat right. As an American-born Chinese, he wanted to assimilate. He wanted to be part of the society around him, and his relatives and their friends just didn't act right, embarrassed him. They acted in ways which seemed impolite. They acted in ways which were troublesome to him. And he points this out. I think one needs to listen to this. How do you help a young person understand what it's like when you have parents or grandparents who have moved out of one culture into another culture? Because they won't act right. They won't sound right. They won't eat right, because from a person like this who's born here, they see the differences. And it embarrasses them. And it's troublesome to them. So all of you who are in temples here in Los Angeles with ethnic groups, I can guarantee you that you ought to read this book, because the second and third and fourth generations of the people who are occupying your temples are going to face similar issues to what he's faced. And they're going to have similar hostility and angers about why their families are different. And it's hard when you're young to be different. Some of you have experienced it. You know what that's like. It's really hard. And so when I look at Mr. Young's book, I felt really tearful for him. He suffered. Now you could say, but he lived in an affluent family. He lived not far from where we're sitting right this moment. He went to college. He got so much. You can say, well, he's just a crybaby. But it's not that. It is how to help the next generations understand the previous generations. It's very important. If we don't teach our children about their roots and to understand and appreciate where they came from, then you're going to get this more and more. You know, when I taught at Berkeley for many years, at first, when I first started teaching in the 1960s, a long time ago, when I first started teaching, I got all the hippies. And for a long time, my courses in Buddhism were filled with hippies, that is, counterculture people who were Caucasian primarily, who came in to have an alternative to a culture that they felt was bankrupt. Then the Vietnamese War ended. Within hours of ending, it was as if the air had gone out of that whole movement. It was gone. It was just gone. I've never seen anything disappear so fast. There are still holdouts, but generally speaking, it was gone. Then my classes filled up with Asian Americans looking for their roots. And I could see that the hunger finally had come to them. Some of them were even third generation, so they were saying, I've never understood my grandmother. She goes off to the temple and she lights these incense and she chants these funny things, and I don't know what she's saying and I don't know what she's doing. So I'm going to take this class to find out what my grandmother is doing. So I used to ask everybody in class from the first class, those of you who are here to find out what your grandmother is doing, raise your hand. And about half the people would raise their hand. Yeah, that's me. I want to know, what is that older generation doing? What's going on there? Is there any value in it? Is there something that I'm not seeing? I love them, and yet I hate them at the same time. And that's what this book is about. It's about this love-hate relationship of one generation to another. Love each other and just can't stand each other. And we have to figure out, how can we deal with that? It's a very important issue. The other issue that's coming about for us, of course, is life expectancy. It's increasing all the time. I'm sitting here as a prime example. If I had lived 100 years ago, I'm sure I would be dead. In other words, if we are able to vaccinate people and help them get over all the issues which they face as children, and we have high support systems for health, and you can give a shot to an adult like myself, an old person, a shot for pneumonia that normally kills you, and there's a shot for it. Hey, I go down to Walgreens and say, stick me, go ahead, give it to me. I don't want to die of pneumonia. I'll do it, I'll get the shot. But life expectancy carries with it a lot of big issues. And what's interesting is that life expectancy is social, and it's also economic. If you're a high school dropout, your life expectancy is far lower than somebody who has a college degree. And there are very specific reasons for this kind of life expectancy issues. So, for example, China is now faced for the first time that the population of the people born after 1980 have become the largest group in China. In other words, our generational issues come to us when the younger group becomes the dominant group, and then we have to face what that means. So you have these kinds of charts that show that it used to be, it narrowed at the top very much, but now that we keep people alive, it's getting more and more people at the top. But then here I am still living. You got to take care of me. I'll try to do my best to take care of myself, but I know that I use the medical system far more than most of you do, because old people just have to do that. We are very expensive. We are not cheap. And we've got to have somebody to pay the bill. And maybe we've theoretically saved up enough money to do it, or have pensions or other things, but in the long run, the younger generation has to provide that kind of assistance for the health. So we can see that when the world grows to 9 billion in the last big chart here, that the people who are the older group is just getting bigger all the time. In other words, aging in the city, urbanism and aging, these are big issues for us. So right now, in this country, we already have a situation where the population of elderly, myself included, is now larger than the 12 to 24 age group. We outnumber that group. That's a big issue too. In other words, we're faced with these kind of demographic issues. So the question is, how do we handle it? And so we have in Oregon, Death with Dignity Act. The Death with Dignity Act allows a physician to help you end your life if you wish it. And you can see from the chart, even though it's hard to read, you can see that the blue are the number of people who get the prescriptions for what you take if you want to do it. And the red is those who actually take them and have an assisted suicide. That issue is very poignant in one way, because when you ask people in Oregon, why are you doing this? Why do you choose to have assisted suicide? 63% said because they do not want to be a burden on their family, friends, or caregivers. So how do we handle this? What is it that we have to do in terms of how we handle our aging population? If people who are aging feel that they are a burden, then it's obvious that many of them will choose to do this, as we see with the law changes. And I think that what's going on in Oregon is happening many places quietly. Nobody says anything about it, but it's there. So the world's median age is, as you can see, very high, except for Africa. And it's Africa in terms of the world of the future where we have all the young people. That's where they are. And so I think that because of that, we have to ask the question of what is the role? Does Buddhism have a role with Africa? If they're the young people, then that's going to be the future. In many ways, that's going to be the economic power source for labor. There's no place else much that we can look to. So we can see already that in just a very short period of time, Western Africa grew from 2,500 cities to 6,000 cities. In other words, the younger generation is already beginning to populate cities. They are becoming urbanites. So is the Liberian map a stamp, which I've tried to get a copy of, I'd love to have one. Buddhism in Africa was a stamp. And when you read on the internet and the blogs from Africa, how many people say, hey, the Buddha was African. Look at all those images. He had curly hair, he had thick lips, and he was African, for pity's sakes. And just get over it. He was one of us. So does Africa and these young people of Africa constitute a future population for Buddhism in terms of this? Foguan Shan has built a similar place to Shilai Temple in South Africa. A beautiful complex in South Africa. In the Congo, there are very active Theravada centers already. I think sometimes we broadcast, or we have people in the Congo who tune into and watch some of the U.S. activity that Glenn puts together. China is becoming the biggest player with sub-Saharan Africa. They are far ahead of the rest of us in saying, recognize this is a place to be. So part of what may happen in Africa will come with the Chinese immigration and businesses that go in there from China. And this is an interesting thing for me. The green is exports and the blue is imports. And you can see that where the green, the exports are very big and the blue is very small, those are some of the poorest places in the world. In other words, they ship it all out. We buy it. They're producers. Whereas in Europe, for example, it's the richest place in the world. It's not the US, it's Europe. People in Europe are much wealthier than the average American. You can see the blue in Europe, that their imports are very high. They send out almost nothing. So we're faced with these inequalities. And that's also an issue which we will come to grips. So if you're in a city, I always feel question that people ask me, why do people build these big churches and these big centers? What is the reason for this, these architectural monuments that are being built? And I feel that it's similar to what you see in a rainforest. If you go to a rainforest, you have a little vine that starts down at the bottom of a tree. The tree may be 80 feet high. That little plant has only one thing to do in life, and that is to shoot straight up to the sun. It's got to get up above everything else, or it dies. That's what I feel when we look in urban cities. It's like a rainforest. How in the world do you get up to where you become visible? How can a religion be visible in this kind of urban density? And one of the ways to do that is architecture. You can make yourself known through your architecture. And it works. It really works. That's your best advertisement sometimes. You have to set yourself apart somehow in this massive thing. So if you just occupy an office building, nobody's going to see you. They're not going to see you. So here in Los Angeles, I think two prime examples of trying to stand out religiously. One is Shilai Temple. The other is the Wilshire Synagogue, the Jewish synagogue. You really make a statement when you go to a major street and you put up this enormous and beautiful structure. So the architectural drive in the city is reasonable from the point of view that it attracts attention and it's a way to draw people together. And because of this, for example, with what we see with like Shilai Temple, you create a community there. That is, people go there who see each other and who become known to one another. It's for every temple. Your people come from all over. They don't just come from the next few blocks. So you have these intentional communities that are built up, and some of them eventually come because of the architecture. They see this place and they think, ah, look at that, that's interesting, or there's something that looks like home, and they go there. And then they find a community, and then that becomes a way of dealing with the city, the urban, is to make a community. How do you get attention? How do you make a community? You have to sell yourself. There's no question. In a city, if you just sit back and wait for somebody to find you, you may never be found. You may never be found. I had a student in Hong Kong, and she said, I'm so afraid to finish the university because I'm just going to disappear into the business world and nobody will ever see me again. It'll just absorb me. The kind of fear of losing all of your characteristics of being who you are, just being absorbed right back into massive city structure. So what I'm saying with urbanism is, number one, it's a reality. It's worldwide. It's increasing. It's going to increase. Urbanism has its values. It also has problems. Community. How you can help people with their lives in this kind of environment, particularly those who have no particular neighborhood community, but have to go across town to find their community. They have to drive. Maybe that's why the freeways of Los Angeles are so full. People are out looking for a community. They're driving somewhere to find that community. So that the Buddhist tradition, as well as other religions, I think, have to prepare themselves for an urban world. And they have to understand, and I think it's very difficult, I would suspect, for example, from Sri Lanka, to come from Sri Lanka to Los Angeles, very difficult because you're coming from a place that's 80% rural to a place that's 80% urban. That alone is an enormous jolt to the whole system. So the things which people are accustomed to who have come as immigrants from a rural tradition is they want to preserve those rural aspects of face-to-face communities and their own local foods and everything which they treasure. And it's fine. And they'll travel long distances to have it. But will their children want it? Will their grandchildren want it? And these are the big questions which are before us when we think about urbanism. Thank you.